examine what is the context, who was this spoken to, in which situation was it spoken to, why was it said, etc. So what are the commentaries, what do the commentaries explain with regard to that passage? So Lama Tsongkhapa very thoroughly investigates the context, the circumstances, etc. The conclusion of that scripture. Also, what does it say at the conclusion, the summary of that scripture? So it takes all that into consideration to then interpret the meaning of that. And Geshe-la is saying, this is not like, well, I just sometimes take something just out of context and explain just a few words.
제상다 시크랑 카도 도신 어절나 이메도 메스 라바이나 능가 주의주의 어절나 이메도디 다 가셔들이 라바이나로 능가 주의주의 메도도 냐빌로디 딘진샤고지로 유천의 전나 디차로로.
So with respect to the flower that appears to us, that doesn't exist. Taking that kind of out of context, it seems that this is the object of negation, and so therefore it would follow that when we think there is a flower, well, that means it is the appearing flower that appears to us, and therefore that's the object of negation, so therefore that flower doesn't exist. So that when we think flower, the flower that we think of doesn't exist.
샤리 메도 난데 얘기 메도디 가자이나 안 메도도 냐빌로디 딘진차로로.
So if the flower that appears to us was the object of negation, then the appearing flower, the flower we take to mind, could not exist.
지단에 따돈이 거디 요즘 사셔도와 되르셔. 그 전행 마시나 책직라 안 과담이라면 뭐 용되다. 뒤에도 전행 뭐 집에 주는 뒤치기 섬당사 가와도 어쩌나마도.
So therefore in general this is one of the most difficult things when it comes to most difficult issues when it comes to identifying emptiness or talking about emptiness, because of not understanding these words. Words are not that clear. So not understanding the words that one another uses, there's misunderstanding. So without discussion, thorough discussion of what does actually this word mean, what does it refer to, only with that clarification are we able to really talk about emptiness in an effective way.
디나신 디다 도바유의 지카르도스나 다난데 디시네다 메도신 난데 메도신의 메도딘을 찍어지 디 다시 응원이 유명세를 납사디 다난데 메도디 딘줄라 샤나 메도디 유명세레스 커도 다른 납샤나 모다 디가나야 다시 응원이 유명세레스디 딘줄니 차르는데 딘줄디 다시 응원이 유명세레디 다시 응원이 유버디 데버디 되로 딘줄디 딘줄 유명 데버 유명세레 랑엔저지 차르도.
So if according to Genma if the flower that appears to us and the truly existing flower are the same, in other words, the object of negation is the same, then here he's saying that when you search for the flower, which is actually the object of negation, the way we search for it is by way of analyzing whether or not it exists from the side of the basis of imputation. Now, when you search for something, whether it exists from the side of the basis of invitation, you're searching for the inherent existence, the true existence. But if you say a truly existent phenomenon, you search for whether it exists truly, then you have the object of negation here twice. It would be sufficient to say you investigate, you search, you analyze whether the truly existent flower exists or not. So you don't have to say, does the truly existent flower exist from the side of the basis of invitation? If it existed from the side of the basis of invitation, it would exist truly. So the truly existent flower exists truly. So you use the object of negation twice, which is not necessary.
아니 디가나 다시 문이 유명세스 시에디 디 가게 단다 기루초기 케바만 케바 다치기 다 케바 하시기 송나다 다란 도로와 다시 문이 매바스 라만에 매바스 다시 문이 매바 돈이기 지시용도 다 강사이나 다 풍병문이 매바 저기 차로로 디 돈이 샤디에 되는 용대기도 딩이 테스트 봐도 이 따다른 돈이 참을 얘기를 강사 풍병문이 매바디 아니 배나 풍교 초바다 체제 강양 강사 많이 또 차나 가사리 분명히 매고 떠오는 저지 말하나와 되는 차례가 분명히 대신부터 막히네 분명히 소바의 세세 강양 가사 말에 대해 가사리 분명히 뭐주고 또 상인 저지 다 간지 있는 개와 몸이 되는 송샤 다 디제도 전에 디 제일 먼저 송나로 같은지 단위 비주치고 정기돼 더 신문이 메시지 니티 정의면 기시 직 정의는 직송라지 제이송나로 가사데 명문이 유명 직비주치는데 더 신문이 여봐 가사 있는 분명히 여봐 매봐 된지 직비주치고 되는 통용이에요
So, with respect to hearsay, another point Geshe is making with regard to Gilles question, when Gilles uses this expression, analyzing whether or not something exists from the side of the basis of imputation. Actually, a lot of scholars use this phrase in order to refer to existing from its own side. So they describe existence from its own side as meaning existing from the side of the basis of imputation. So, therefore, what does it mean for the person to not exist from his or her own side? It means the person does not exist from the side of his or her basis of imputation. Is that truly empty? Geshe is wondering, is the opposite of that, is that truly empty? Is the opposite of existing from the side of the basis of imputation? Is that really emptiness? Why? Because a person who has come to see that the person that itself is not the aggregate, without having seen that the self does not exist separate from the aggregate, without having understood that the person does not exist as separate from the aggregate, if they have only understood that the self is not the aggregate, doesn't that mean they have understood that the self does not exist from the side of the basis of imputation? But there's still a part that they haven't realized, which is the absence of the person existing as separate from the aggregate. So since that is still left, would you have realized full emptiness? Would you have understood emptiness? But Geshe asks anyway, he's wondering whether in Lama Tsongkhapa's writing, is there this phrase that phenomena do not exist from the side of the basis of imputation? Does Lama Tsongkhapa use this phrase in order to refer to the object of negation? Did someone see that? Did any one of you see that kind of quote, that way of expressing it?
단다 벤진로선 주인다 쿠란지 송는 걸 된지 그가 가시지 송는 걸 디요래 가서 먼저 능취지어로 단다 벤 분바 가와라서 가리네 능출 다가랑 같이 능취를 했어 그 분바 능취다 분바를 오늘 주고 능취는 소소 요 말이스 체 요 말이스 선조라 제가 먼저 능취 다가랑 단다 분바 가와서 능데 능취 다가랑 같이 능취 인디잖아요 가셔 체스니 능수 현다지를 지지지야 말이 단단한데 다가랑도 지지지기로 했어. 그래서 능수 다가랑 아니 같이 능수를 했어. 딜이 딘지기 능수 나신 주요 말했어. 디체고를 했어. 어떤 순간
So Benjamin Chujin and other similar scholars, they have talked about that the appearance of pillars and pots and vases, or pillars and vases, that appearance in itself is the appearance of the object of negation. In other words, the way a vase and a pillar appears, in that same way, the object of negation appears. So when one appears, the object of negation appears. So therefore, in order to identify the object of negation, we do not have to look anywhere else. We do not have to look elsewhere. But just the appearance of the vase and the pillar, that in itself comprises the appearance of the object of negation. So therefore, we just need to understand that the phenomenon does not exist by way of that appearance.
제산다 이송용도 전에 딜치딜라 아니 단다 베베나로라 가사티요르와 분바하라 가셔야 생기네. 나와하라 가셔야 창마 여거 되바 창마 가셔야 컨저기 롱도즈 통용디 어다 벤진로서 주인기 기반으로 벤진로서 주인기 코란즈 섬지의 팀을 송샤스 나와 같이 인송샤스 네 롱탕에디 어디다 먼저 능취다 하기 다가랑 같이 능취를 송의 롱디장 이내 디코랑 고단디라 나와 같이 인세지 고조도 근데 용되기도
So some are saying, therefore, when they hear Benjamin Luther says, when they hear when he says, some Tibetans say therefore that the vase is the object of negation. So when you say the vase, so they say the vase is the object of negation. Whatever appears is the object of negation. Everything that exists is the object of negation. So they say that Benjamin Luther is saying actually the same thing. So they take this quotation that when he says that the appearance is the same as the appearance of the vase is the same as the appearance of the object of negation, they take that to mean that the vase itself is the object of negation.
이네 단다바도 중샤베 기루 케바 나로라 나와 가제 인생 수지요 말해.
But so far, followers of the Gelugpa tradition have never said that the appearance itself, that appearing thing, is in itself the object of negation.
분반 나와다 파샤네 데버주가 나와의 가제 인락 말와.
So
나와를 체마 인슬레 그랬던데.
So the appearance of vase, for example, saying the appearance of vase is object of negation, that is not accepted at all. But leaving aside that, not even the appearance of true existence is seen as the object of negation. Why? Because the appearance of true existence, the appearance of inherent existence does exist. So therefore no one asserts, according to the Gelugpa school, that this is the object of negation.
다 디제디자네 예제나 타니 들리잖아 야가면도 다 파게 분바징비 떠바다 나와스네 정도바 지지 떠바다 나와스 정도바 지지 나위 되신 분바디지 나위 되신 아 지지 나와 딸도 주비 돼 나와 딸기 돼 신이야 지지 가셔들 고쳐야지 다 나와는 정도바 지지 다 분지 떠바 나와는 분바난 거를 분바랑은 주바난 거를 지디 나와는 정도바지 나위 되신나 분바디지 나와 딸기 되신나 아니 분바템을 주바를 거야지 타니 들리잖아 감제도
So Geshe-la has suggested the way to use the vocabulary here to make this clear. So the way Geshe-la explains it, there's three kind of different ways of referring to the object of a conceptual consciousness apprehending vase. So when you take a conceptual consciousness apprehending vase, there's just the mere appearance, the appearance of that conceptual consciousness. That which appears, that's the second one. And that, the object that appears in a certain way, the way it appears, the object that is such that it describes the way it appears. So I'm sorry, I don't know how to translate it properly. So therefore, the first one, the mere appearance, is just whatever appears, that exists. So there's the generic image of the vase that appears, there's the vase itself that appears, so there's just an appearance. The appearing object, that which appears, so the appearing object is the vase, the existing vase itself. And the object that appears in a certain way, that is the object of negation. So the way it appears, the object which is such that it appears in a certain way, that refers to the object of negation. So there are three different ways of referring to three different appearances of object that is the object of that conceptual mind.
디제 뒤전에 지당 아니 분바징비 로직이와 분바 유버징 쓰는 데도 분바징 쓰는 지 아니 분바 대면징 버지 분바 텐주징 버지 숨치어 버렸어. 뭐 도스란지도 뭐 텐주징 버지 대면징 버지 아니 디니 관계 개발도 마치 분바징 버지 징버 숨치어 버렸어. 제일 뭐지 뒤순간
So when we talk about in general, apprehending a pot or apprehending a vase, so pot and vase is the same word, sorry, it could be used interchangeably. So you have to talk about three different ways of apprehending a vase. You apprehend just a vase in general. You apprehend a truly existing vase. And you apprehend a not truly existing vase. So there's three different ways of apprehending the vase. Apprehending just vase in general, or apprehending the vase as truly existing, or truly existing vase, or apprehending a vase as not existing truly, so a non-truly existing vase. Three ways. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa said.
근데 아니 분바랑은 여바 나와지 분바랑은 매바 나와지 디니 키보드 관계 키보드 맞으니 분만 나와지 요리베스나 디요말 난 추기지 시험도 야나 라문을 줘봐나 야나 라문이 매봐 난 마도 라문을 줘봐 매봐 가야만 하는 분만 수지 자원이 요말다.
So saying that, if that is the case, but nonetheless, with regard to existing pyramids on site, existing inherently or not existing inherently, so even though we have those three factors that described before, the way it appears, it is impossible that the vase does not either appear as inherently existent or as non-inherently existent. So the way it appears, so even though this vase appears, but the way it appears as either truly existent or inherently existent, or it appears as non-truly or non-inherently existent. Even though vase itself is just
다 디지디 전에 예 데버투바 파게 마징게 데메 마징게 분바징게지 요레스 디 숭기 요르데 얘네 가정님한 디지마 따와 많이 보도 체면이스네디 수준 용덕이 다 분바징가 디레 분바딘시 디레스니 요 체도에 가고 자대요 디지디 전에 다 거시구레 양 송당지를 딘지체 숭고도 제가 다 가자던 취진 이와디 용도비 당문인의 체마토 인장 아니 자유 고와디 차버체 아니 내가 신앙시부 제목하체 디가바 있는다 가자디 가바데 냠도 여바데 가주서레스니 신앙시부게 제목하체 내가 가샤는 되그랬어 정답제 얘기치도 아니 슈라 가리 양추 유츠디 삼당 양 라문의 메당 삼당 도시데 엘바라치데는 고체도 그랬어 신기 다 베나 아니 kumaji shor minga yueba che sha khangba nang lo minga le chala ji la na ta minga khang ten khe ro kumani su yin ze ma chi de ngel minga ga ye chu ju ani shime ship shir ta che ani kuma ngone di china ma do 당원이 낸다 kuma dire la ma to di ta su lo ma wo ro ta da ti se tu ma ro as o tin di chin pe cha ni ani su ye di ke ji tian mu chi su ngu do si ni ni chi mu chi su ngu do So
therefore, with respect to an object, when we perceive an object, we always unless we realize emptiness. So when we apprehend a phenomenon or perceive it, we always perceive it as, or it always appears to us as if it truly existed. So it always appears in such a way. And as we also discussed before, we are therefore, and there's a illusion that escapes, because we're not able to differentiate until we found the correct view, we are not able to differentiate. Differentiate between what? Between the vase that does exist and the vase that does not exist, or the vase that does not truly exist. So therefore, between the truly existing vase and the vase, we cannot differentiate. For us, they're the same. So until we realize emptiness, we cannot distinguish the vase, the actual vase, and the truly existing vase. So therefore, for us, they're the same. And when you think about the basis for the object of negation, which is the vase, the object of negation is the lack of true existence, we don't know the difference initially. What is the object of negation? What is the basis, the actual vase? We cannot distinguish those two. And so when we refute true existence, we may also refute the basis of that true existence. For example, when we try to understand the vase lacks true existence, by negating true existence, we may also negate the vase in general, not just the truly existing vase. So, but there's no problem with that. He's saying we shouldn't be scared of that. Initially, we should just go ahead, because that's part of the practice, to actually just refute. Even if the vase disappears, okay. Then later on, what we can do is then take into consideration how the vase exists, how it actually does exist. Think about this, and slowly we will be able to distinguish those two. We will be able to differentiate between those two. This is similar to the following example. So let's say 5 people come into your house, and one of them is a thief, but you don't know who's the thief. So the best thing is to catch all 5. Don't let any of them go. Catch all 5 of them, and then you investigate which one of them is the actual thief. And then on the basis of that, you then know the actual person. But initially, you take all 5 and investigate them. So this idea has been presented by Kyabje Tijang Rinpoche and by Chi Rinpoche. So this explanation, this way of explaining, comes from different masters such as those two. So that concludes this. Let's go and talk about existence, how do phenomena exist conventionally, or being merely imputed.
Tadi pagi jo imam umata du kar tisha yusiredi.
This is based on Geshe-la's text, which Geshe-la composed when he studied the Madhyamaka. So Inye-Tokchu, or expressing analysis of the Madhyamaka.
Analyzing. Tobe tazam sin kiji shiyondu, tobe tazam se kuwadi na lola, ane toba la tu se kuwadi medini. Toba riri yogo maris, toba la tu se kiji di shiyo maris, ine tobe tazam la choguri la tangchi. Ane tobe tazam se kuwadi na lola, toba la tu se kuwadi kya tangchi niche. Toba la tu la ngindi le yang, ane la tangdi, ane dashi choba tang, ane pegi toba nicho la tu la ngindi. And dashi keje maybe tone toba ki kari taba tagaran tigdungi tawichi halam tat tindegi toba la tusuchi diye pagi ditawa laura tobe tabi jela ane shini mubo di chukdingi o tindegi samsuchi dayang samsuchi dila toba la tuyo inba keje chila yang tuyo tangdi tobe tabi jela shini chubi keje di mayindiwa kurando dunyamdu tang ane di jela shini chubi keje di mayinbi yang tuyo luchik jini. So
with regard to being merely imputed, existing independence on imputation. So this Geshe-la will discuss. This is part of the 10th chapter of this book. So here there are 4 different kinds of opinions that we can hold when one has already the sense that when one holds already that phenomena exist merely independent on imputation. One assertion, the first assertion is that even though phenomena exist merely independent on imputation, that does not mean that they depend on conceptual consciousness. So even though they depend on mere imputation by a conceptual consciousness, someone may assert that they do not accept this, although they depend on mere imputation by a conceptual consciousness, that does not mean that they depend on conceptual consciousness. First assertion. Second assertion is that even though, yes, being independent on imputation by conceptual consciousness means that phenomena do depend on conceptual consciousness in general, but they also depend on the basis of imputation. They depend on both, on a truly existing basis of imputation and on imputation by conceptual consciousness. That's the second. The third view is that phenomena only depend on a conceptual consciousness. Only depend on a conceptual consciousness for their existence. The fourth view is that, the third view still includes, that this conceptual consciousness has to first arise in order for then the object to come into existence. So the third view is therefore, phenomena only depend on a conceptual consciousness, but the phenomenon can only come into existence after that conceptual consciousness has arisen. The fourth view is that phenomena do depend on a conceptual consciousness, on imputation by that, but the phenomenon can exist before the conceptual consciousness arises, or at the same time as the conceptual consciousness arises. So those are 4 views that Geshe-la expresses or indicates here.
That Dangodi Karesana, any injuta di tindiri, that Lusilingi Kibenangone, Nimanta, Jeffy Dodder, which you Google Monday, Sungi CH. Again, Tobe doesn't see the Toba Comares, and in Tobe doesn't love Chogre. Ani pene kilochi yo residu injimji kya gumundas ko chicheli kilochi yo na kya ne majane kilochi yo rbas tena shu ko yebi chedi 안 또베 따베 점기 유출디 아니 지나 디레마도 디레 또버레리 인지미지 고마레 에스에지 다 딘제트로 치레 다 송균디 이내 송균시에디 알레하고 시라르다 그래서는 등산이나 다 주제하고 유디 책이 제일 체감해 보진 예요로 책지에 체감해 보진 리포팅 제도가 알아 다 송균기지 시용된 것은 시작이 때부터 딘제장 당당 요마로 그시 야부여는 것도 라버도 타마 두세도 단단하게 말해 얘기 년뒤 전에 아니 직송요래 안디 책 체감해 보진 다른 냐도고 말아 진짜 배디니 다가랑 책 다가랑 샤고에 가르스는 배디 다가랑 녀가스의 책이 인거들 앉아 책 배디 다가랑 진짜 배디기 톤 바게티 그 아니 딜라 아니 가랑기 다 고아 렌즈디 마그 안 딜라 아니 심주지 딜 디지도 전에 다 도베다 좀시디 그 소바다 차시단 딜이 든시 째는 얘기 매번 인상 안 도베다 좀라디레스 이내 바게 도베다 좀시디 도버리리 고야린두스 아니 100kg 잡나 시레스 어디르다 또 되는 거지. 그래서 근줄로 뭐 남게도 고난기 꾸고마.
So here, this idea, the first kind of view here, the first view Geshe-la expresses here right at the beginning of the 10th chapter, which is the view that, yes, even though phenomena exist by way of being merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, that does not mean that every phenomenon needs a conceptual consciousness or depends on a conceptual consciousness. So this is apparently, as it is being explained, the view of a Losei monastery, a Drepung Losei monastery master, the previous incarnation of Losei master called Kyabje Khabdin. So it was his previous life reincarnation who is said to have presented that kind of view. And so the example, and Geshe-la presents this view in his book, when he says that this view is usually expressed or it is illustrated by way of an example. So even though you say this is the measure, this is how phenomena exist, they're merely imputed by conceptual consciousness, but we do not need for every phenomenon of conceptual consciousness, this is a little bit like when you have 1 kilo, you don't necessarily need a scale to have 1 kilo. So you don't need 1 kilo to measure, you don't need a scale in order to measure or to have 1 kilo. So it's that same way. In the same way, this is how this master explains it, and Geshe-la actually used the same wording that have been passed down. However, the problem is saying this was passed down by the previous reincarnation, the previous incarnation of Kyabje Khabdin. The problem is there were no MP3 players, no tape recorders. Our memory is not a very helpful, it's not a very reliable recording, because the person who says this has been passed down as coming from this master may have just remembered it wrongly. So Geshe-la is saying, I'm not too sure he really said that. But anyhow, the idea is here that the example, just as with the scale, you don't need a scale to have a kilo. So therefore, phenomena are said to be merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. Why? Because upon searching for them, upon analyzing them, you cannot find the object from the side of the object, in the sense that the object does not exist as part of the aggregates or part, it is not its part, it is not a collection of the parts, and it does not exist separate from the parts. So therefore, not being able to find it is the same as saying the phenomenon is merely imputed. But you do not need a conceptual consciousness. This is the kind of assertion here, the very first assertion, that you do not need a conceptual consciousness in each case for the object to exist.
在它的支分跟它的总体以及支分总体之外找不到的缘故，所以就是我有。
So this is just someone's opinion that has been passed down, and Geshe-la will now explain, give his own explanation to this and a discussion in this text.
경건정한테 하게 되지 군대 경건음식 숨지 못 봐라. 돈이 거시 인슈다다. 근데 지금은 두스라네 섬시시대. 경기다 군대에 따라 숨샤스. 아니 양전인데 군대 뒤송면 됐어. 왜냐면 년도 전에 경기 고거를 얘기했고. 친구가 얘가 아니 군대 숙련도 딱 년도 전에 경기 고라듯이 고거를 왜 얘기를 들으시고.
So So Geshe-la then Geshe Khyentse Wangde from Ladakh. So Geshe Khyentse Wangde from Ladakh, once when he listened to Swami's teachings, he was transcribing them. He was transcribing them and he was teaching on Madhyamika. So Geshe-la was correcting what Geshe Khyentse Wangde was transcribing. And so Geshe-la said, no, His Holiness didn't say that. His Holiness said such and such. And Geshe Khyentse Wangde said, no, I don't agree. His Holiness said such and such. So they both sat down to listen to it again. And while they were both listening, Geshe Khyentse Wangde heard what he had said he'd heard, and Geshe-la heard what he said he'd heard. So even when they listened to it at the same time, they both heard something totally different and didn't agree.
结果呢，对不起，
就他们在一起听的时候呢，给这种听到的是老师有点听到那个，老师听到是有点给这个人听到那个过来。
다디 숭윤들 아니 제바시 체네 디지도 가르스나 책이 아니 떠버리제 고마레 숭이나 떠버리제 란다 뒤념도 오늘 주고 말에 숭이나 근데 세고 요마로다 쇼쇼지마도 요마로 제선당이 있디다 바기 도주 지셔다디 떠버리제 고마레 세디 쿠란다 뒤념도다 쿠란 문도 주고 말에 비기제레베 지단에 떠버리제 요고 말에 쓰기 예슬란다 기버치네요.
So, with regard to this lineage of explanations, that's called in Tibetan, some master gives some oral kind of explanation. So, with regard to this oral investigation, oral explanation that is said to have been given by the Rinpoche, so Geshe-la, he investigated this. What does this mean? If phenomena are not, as it is explained here, according to his explanation, that every phenomenon does not depend on the conceptual consciousness. Does that mean that every phenomenon does not need conceptual consciousness in general, or does it mean every phenomenon does not need conceptual consciousness at the same time when it exists, when the object exists, or every object does not need a conceptual consciousness that precedes the object? So those are the three possibilities. A conceptual consciousness in general is not needed, a preceding conceptual consciousness, or conceptual consciousness that exists simultaneously with the object. That's what Geshe-la has been investigating.
다 아니 떠버리제 지단에 떠버리제 요고 말에스 라바이나 아니 시자바다 아니 시제비 질바나 걸라 더버 유바 쿠니 유바니다 떠바메 버리 유바니메 바세야 잡다 어디서기 아니 롱도서 개주도스 이 기시 디더 지시디 신다지 잡아이나 떠버 유나 요리 떠바메네 요바리스 된다디 말에라니 지시 신다지 잡이 온다 땅바 이나야 아니 가상 아주 남기치몽디 로인바 시제비 제비 책디기 라마 신라라마레 바세디 말로용디 디지시디 아니 신라라마레 바세디 아니 규현라마레 비기자마레 유신 타니비 시버신 더 신샤네 딜라라마레 비기자레스라니 다 가산다 니치모나 숨데 두수다 아니 게루도스
So here saying that not every phenomenon. So to say that not each phenomenon needs a conceptual consciousness, well, that is actually in contradiction, stands in contradiction to the 400 verses. It stands in contradiction to what it says in the 400 verses, where it says, without conceptual consciousness, desire and so forth has no existence. What intelligent person will grasp at the actual object and conceptual consciousness? That would be the first quote. Moreover, in the commentary to that, in the commentary, Chandrakirti's commentary on the 400, it says, only based on the existence of conceptual consciousness do they exist, and without conceptual consciousness, their existence does not come to be. Without that, they're like a snake imputed upon a coiled rope, definitely without being established by way of their own nature. So this would be two quotes that Geshe-la gave in here that we also had in the handout previously that contradict that. And then also on another occasion, Geshe-la gave the quote from the Lamrim Chenmo by Lama Tsongkhapa. On the English translation, it's on page 212. 212 towards the end, when commenting on Chandrakirti on a certain quote from the 400 stanzas, when Chandrakirti says it is that which exists essentially and so forth, he's saying that here phenomena do not exist without depending on another. He does not refer to dependent on causes and conditions, but he says depending on something other means depending on a conventional consciousness. So that is found in the Lamrim Chenmo.
다 비신이 있는 다 디교법밖에 다와지 니 나올라 된다 하오래. 대 자세지 담살을 구르지 슬라베.
So for those of you who know Tibetan, this book, the book that Geshe-la's book he's reading from, will be published very shortly, within 1 month, and it's being 100 copies are being sent up in order to be distributed here in Kaohsiung. For those of you who
다 디네 엔티나 신지기 안에 우마 공부를 세나로래 안에 신나라래 송도 랑원이 주바세디 신나라마래 바세디 엔 타니비 또 신나라마래 바스 어디를 자니 음식문을 찍고 송도.
And so likewise in the illumination of the thought by Lama Tsongkhapa in an earlier passage, it also says, furthermore, an inherent nature of phenomena that is not dependent on another phenomenon, namely on an object possessor, the conventional conceptual consciousness, an essence that is not posited through the power of such a conceptual consciousness, that very essence is called the self that is to be negated. So here, therefore, in another passage that Geshe-la cites in his book, it also says that the self that is to be negated is a phenomenon that does not exist through the power of the conceptual consciousness.
안티나 신지기 백에 베제노로래야 딱점 샤즘 기점해버체 따바인 샤바인 딘지기 아니 또베 따바인 또베 샤바인 세 딘지 치 뭐고 용되기도 디나 신디어레 타니비 또베 왕기 타니기 왕기 여바인스 어떤지 치요로 디지디 엔 타니 코나키네메나 대단 대다로다 또바 메딩이 이런지 또바 메비 취시 여바이나 안 코진비 또바 코라메나 안 또바디 샤신 티기민도 왔어 디티기요나 아니 체던지 모신부기 또베 샤다네 디종이 차도로 왔어 모신부스나 하고라.
So likewise we find in explanations like this eloquent speech, there are phrases that say being imputed by conceptual consciousness, being posited by conceptual consciousness. But then you also have the phrase that phenomena exist through the power of convention, through the power of verbal or mental conventions, or through the power of conventions. So this means that if there are no conventions, only having a conceptual consciousness is not enough. If there were no conventions but only conceptual consciousness, well, that would be like saying that phenomena exist that phenomena exist in dependence on a conceptual consciousness that perceives a child of a barren woman or an infertile woman. So this is an example of non-existent, the child of a barren woman. So if a conventional word or a verbal convention were not necessary, only a conceptual consciousness was needed, then phenomena are absurdly, it would follow that they would be established or they would be posited by way of a conceptual consciousness that perceives the child of a barren woman.
Tene gisiyondi ani ta khashigi ta tida ta khashesini bingusu yobi chawayamare.
So here saying that, well, someone says, the Geshe-la says, well, when I say someone says, it doesn't necessarily mean there's really someone there.
Di penji kenzo khashele yang pensigire 팅이 제딩이 주의나 수비제 티 아니 그게 저거 저 전행제서 여러와 다 팅이 딘지 저 명인도 전행진 가시도 용수 로봇 남편이 전행제 우리 가시도 전행제 고거라 말와 저선 뒤줄라 얘기 지나디 팽기를 섬증이도 니디 제디 디 베제디 차이디 낀디 가르스나 나 차는 저걸 토마토 같이 딘지기 강해지 체 아니 백이 디치는 게 겹치도 남서 수부투 디치도 이 저거 제기 디토라 강해지 체 디치비 가라 아니 나라 삼단제 아니 디된다 디리 신마지 말한기 베저나 고아 경기 순교는 선의 차로디 지티 아니 디제 마티베이나 된다디 수세라 양수세 신사주 고대주 된다디라 양교 디티기도 미도선 삼단에 가보도 니를 수수기 삼차디 마티 다디 미신다 이미기절다 안신이 마 로지 그래 주디 티기도 미도 디를 교회 가도라나 삼로 프레 레라오도
So the reason I wrote this text here, the reason I wrote this The reason I wrote this text is because when I wrote this is when I was this was when I was studying in Jehovah's Witness, and I got quite well. I think it's beneficial. I think it's beneficial for you. Because for those of you who go and debate with other people all the time, then you have someone to actually debate with. So there's someone to discuss this with. But if you and you may be able to, even if you can't go to a debate, you may be able to discuss it with someone else, with another person. But if you do not have this opportunity, this will be beneficial. Why? Because I presented different definitions, and the reason I wrote this book was when I was very sick and I couldn't go to the debate. I couldn't go to the debate because I was so sick. And so every time I shouted, like when I debated, my body got quite sick. And so therefore I wrote this down, so it was really beneficial for me. I was thinking, this is someone who debates with me. These are kind of the discussions that would come forth. And so it was very beneficial to put this forth. So this is another person who debates, and then I debate back. So it was really good for me to analyze because I myself couldn't go to the debate because I was so sick. So this is really like you have another person there debating with you, and that's why this was saying it may be beneficial for you if you read this because it's really like having a debate going on.
네, 양 이마 가시시대야 뒤에 상담제 뒤치기도 민도신 뒤치기 민도선이 꽤 다른다지비 꽤 통내지 통나 안내지 다 대기 성취디 가지는 봤다. 우리가 시에다 뒤람나 뒤기 민도는 꽤 뒤. 야 니마 진이 샤지 진이 제라 크이견지 지교디야 다다르기 때문에 야삼다. 들리체다.
So then he wrote something down, and after a few days then he checked, so whatever was his own view at that time, he checked then whether that was contradictory with regard to scripture and reasoning, and then if he said what he wrote before was contradictory, then it became someone else. So he then, whatever view there was, it became someone else, and then he checked it again, he went back and forth, he checked it again, and after some days, again, he changed his view again. So there was this constant kind of analysis and reflection he engaged in, trying to kind of find the correct view.
그래서 다 된지치기치기 그거 되게 좋아지. 딱 배나 딱이 섬심이라고 숨쉬시도 타만디 땅아 잠샤가라 먹이다 디르다 심주지에 잠샤가라면 섬주디 차대. 다 디제라 데스테 섬당마도 미숙하네 노초제 투여 말아. 제 투여는 야 디카지나는 지 신다시 레시로.
So anyway, so this is kind of like his different views. We changed it again and again, but then his different views that he filtered out here. This was kind of like the end conclusion, the final conclusion he came to. So he said, like, I couldn't really study it properly. So if I had continued that, it would have again become different.
就是他当你洗到最后，你看到最后那个想法，就是他当你停下来的时候的那个想法。 那在这个之后呢，虽然他还是有去做一些思维，可是已经不像当年把全部的精力都放在这个上面。所以如果他还能够再去在这个主题上去思维的话呢，那以上的这个比如说第4宗之后，可能还会有第5宗、第6宗等等。
第几的我先把这个我的给这介绍，可能人人都相当的，他人人开始讨论呀，那么相当的一起几个门都是，安尼第他给这第4个门都可能因为了，给这第4是的没影响，给这第4个门都开始过来是，是对安尼你第了第来，别那安尼叫我们去给这都使用的，安尼一起这个门都呢，心定呢他没来过了的，安没是把第4年了。mes yo mares ani shine diverse dance dila garjin meres sene ani diverse dance ani meda melu ani yoela na garjin yores diverse dance di lens rasun ya lenditi ya lend ta da tiki de ta mes in len rasun lenditi mes in ta da tiki de ta da ani yeki trailer su samlu thane ye trailer pendo yon sigres lawai ani koran ki pendo yongu dos ama se koran ki di 배제 견자만 이마지 근데 리딩은 로라 디비지 당기여서 내가 지디 차시 딩기로 아니 코라이 섬사디티 아니 아디 차시디 딩기들 배제 당기여서 딜라기도 디지디 카시디 팬시기로 왔다디.
So once someone asked me, he said